Of Laura Aguilar's history, she was born and raised in California's San Gabriel Valley, and she is known for her portraits of historically excluded and marginalized people from various communities across LA. She eventually turned the camera on to herself to consider the multitude of factors that defined her own identity as a working-class Chicana, a lesbian, and also somebody who lived with depression and a learning disability. In the mid-1990s, Aguilar began to photograph herself and other women in the nude in natural settings, creating 5 series that highlight the inherent connections between nature and the female form. Nudes in Nature brings together nearly 60 photographic works from these series for the very first time. Exhibited in conversation, they encourage reflection on the ways female bodies are perceived within the natural world in comparison to how they are viewed in social and cultural spaces. All of the images in Nudes in Nature were made in the southwestern region of the United States, and with this particular backdrop, the exhibition provides a unique opportunity to consider Aguilar's trailblazing work within the context, of course, this great desert home. I want to express my deep gratitude to Sybil Venegas and Christopher Velasco, trustees of the Laura Aguilar Estate, who co-curated this incredible exhibition and are with us today to be in conversation. It's always an incredible opportunity to hear from artists, but also to hear from curators who've known these artists and who are continuing to work with this particular material, and we are grateful that they traveled to the museum to join us. Phoenix Art Museum is honored to present this exhibition along with our long-going partnership with the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona in Tucson. We are grateful to our colleagues at the CCP, and I'm happy to recognize those with us today. Todd DeBudis, the Center's director, and Emilia Mickevicius, the Norton family assistant curator of photography, who splits her time between the Center for Creative Photography and the Phoenix Art Museum. Emmy was also the organizing curator for this exhibition, and we thank you, Emmy, for all that you did and all your hard work in putting this. This is her first exhibition here at the museum, so let's give her a round of applause. We also do want to recognize, unfortunately, the Center for Creative Photography's chief curator, Becky Senf, could not make it today, but we really want to recognize her work in also supporting this particular project, and also along a lot of the work that was done in the interim before, of course, we've welcomed Emmy to the PHXR staff. I also want to thank the exhibitions and prep team for mounting this tremendous exhibition. This is a little bit new for us in terms of how we approach photography exhibitions here at the museum, and there are some really exciting things to come that we're really looking forward to, and I know all of you who enjoy photography will have a lot to look forward to in the next coming years. I also want to express our welcome and thanks to many community partners and supporters who helped bring this exhibition together. I want to thank Jackie Ailing from the Arizona Commission on the Arts, who was instrumental in helping support this exhibition, as well as those generous individuals who really support the ongoing efforts to make exhibitions excellence here at the museum truly something that we can be proud of. And I want to recognize the Opatrony Family Foundation and Joan Kremen for their support in bringing incredible exhibitions to the museum and for making this really, truly an exciting place. So let's give them a round of applause and gratitude. Last but not least, we are again thrilled to have this conversation today to hear a little bit more about this incredible exhibition and this incredible artist who is so deserving of this attention and just to share this work with a wider community. So to start the conversation today, it is my esteemed honor and pleasure to welcome up my colleague, Olga Viso, our Selig family chief curator here at the Phoenix Art Museum, to introduce our guest today. So thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. So I do have the great privilege of introducing our speakers who'll be in conversation with Emmy today. So Sybil Venegas, who is a trustee of the Aguilar Estate and one of the co-curators of the show, is an independent art historian, curator, and Professor Emerita of Chicana Studies at East Los Angeles College. She is among the first art historians to historicize Chicana art and is recognized scholar in Chicana feminist art history, as well as the cultural politics of Dia de los Muertos ceremonials in Chicanx and Latinx communities. As a commentator on Los Angeles' curatorial and multicultural visual arts community that spanned this landscape, Professor Venegas' extensive experience in this area and talking about Chicano and Chicana art community has spanned the early years of that production. She was the curator of the landmark 2018 exhibition, traveling exhibition Laura Aguilar Show and Tell. And later this year, she will also curate an exhibition in Tucson at the Center for Creative Photography titled Chicano Photographers LA. Joining her, Christopher Velasco is a photographer, performance artist, and teacher based in Los Angeles. His work considers the queer brown body and incorporates horror and camp aesthetics. Christopher received his MFA at UC Santa Barbara and his BFA from Cal Arts. He's held positions at the Santa Monica Museum of Art, which is now the ICA in Los Angeles, and UCLA's Chicano Studies Research Center and Library. His work has been featured in numerous exhibitions at institutions including the Art Center College of Design, Cal Arts, Hibbleton Gallery, Getty Museum, and the Vincent Price Art Museum. And in addition, Christopher has performed with Harry Gamboa Jr. and Virtual Verite and at Los Angeles Union Station, UC Santa Barbara, the list goes on, Last Projects Gallery. And finally, Emilia Mickevicius is stepping in, as Jeremy mentioned, for Becky Semp to moderate this conversation, and she is the Norton Family Assistant Curator who joined in this dual appointment that we've shared for over the last decade with the CCP and at the University of Arizona, joined us this summer. So, Emmy, thank you for your good work. She's joined us from San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and we're so thrilled to have her on staff. I want to thank Paul Rogers and our education and engagement team for organizing today's program. So please join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage. We look forward to hearing all you have to share with us today. And thanks again for joining us, everyone.
Let's get these turned on. This works. Excellent. Okay. Olga and Jeremy, thank you so much for those generous introductions, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate the work of Laura Aguilar, who is such an incredible artist. We are so thrilled to be able to share her work with you through this exhibition, Nudes in Nature. I'm so happy to be sitting here with Christopher and Sybil. And the way that we envision this event is that we'll spend about an hour in conversation. We'll be looking at lots of images together that Chris and Sybil gathered to tell stories about Laura. And then we'll open it up for audience Q&A in about the last 15, 20 minutes of the event or so. So as we're having our conversation, please be thinking of questions. This is such a special opportunity to, spend time with people who really knew Laura very well and were very close with her. And so, it'll be really valuable for all of us to hear the responses that they'll have to your questions. So, okay, let's dive right in. Christopher and Sybil, I wonder if we might begin by having you take us back in time a bit. Can you each describe how you came to know Laura and where both you and Laura were at in your respective lives and careers when you met?
Yeah,
I'll start. Yeah, I met her first. Laura was my student, and as was mentioned, I taught for many years at East Los Angeles College, which is kind of an iconic community college on the east side of Los Angeles. Everybody goes there, and Laura was there, and I was teaching a course in Mexican modernism, and the day she came to my class, it was Frida Kahlo was the subject, and she just joined her friend, who later became a very well-known writer, Gil Quadros. Anyway, he signed up for my class. She decided to add the class with him, or actually she didn't. She came to the class with him just to get a ride home from him. And she was entranced by the slides and the material I was talking about. So she added the class, and she was this very shy young woman. Is that the Mexico?
It's the self-portrait.
Yeah, the self-portrait. So the self-portrait that's up there right now is probably what she looked like at the time I met her. She had just gotten out of high school. Her mother had just died. So she was in a very transitional moment in her life and became a very curious student. She photographed images for the campus newspaper, and I remember seeing her name and seeing her photographs of just campus events. And when she was in my class, it's like, oh yeah, I know who you are. I've seen your photographs. And they were good, of just the college activities. Over time, we became more friendly. I started inviting her to events around town. I introduced her to self-help graphics and art, which was probably one of the more important early Chicano art spaces that did Day of the Dead activities. They had a gallery. In fact, I worked there for a year before I started teaching. And she was just excited. And I also began to introduce her to artists, as we will see some of them on the slides in a little bit. And as time went on and she moved on, we remained friends. And that story of our friendship and what happened, we'll progress with that later in our talk, but that's how I met her.
Yeah, I met her at East LA College. I was a student. I was also Sybil's student. Everybody went to East LA College. So Laura's mentor was my mentor in East LA College in the photo department. So I met Laura about 2003, 2004, and she was starting to work on the Grounded series. So she came in because my mentor at the time, May Valenzuela, she's like, hey, I have this artist who's local. She's going to come in and talk about her work to the class. And that was the first time I ever met Laura. We saw her work and it was transformative. Then after the talk, I hung out with Laura in the dark, not in the dark room, it was what's the room? Where they give out the equipment room, and she was looking at my work, and we just kind of connected. She said I reminded her of Gil Cuadros, which is kind of interesting. Then we just started hanging out, and that's how I met Laura. And then I started to, it just became like a quick friendship, and then we just like clicked, and I knew her since then, so that's how I met Laura. So.
It's great. Yeah, so many meaningful kind of connections between people, all these interrelated figures there. Can you tell us a bit about Laura's upbringing and her early life? And Sybil, I know you've done a great deal of research about her ancestry, so I'd love to hear more about that and why it kind of informs and matters to her work.
I think that's real important. So Laura and I met in the early 80s, but when we were working on Show and Tell, which was her retrospective in 2017, I was originally brought on that project as a writer. I later became the curator through a bunch of different changes that happened at the museum. But Laura and I had wanted to have a show where I curated the show, and I would do a solo show. It just never happened. We ended up joining the Getty Project in 2017. So I was brought on as a writer, and as I was working with Laura, I said, you know what, let's do a biographical piece, because at that point she was sick, and she wasn't going to last too long. And I thought, this is the most valuable thing I can do, because I have her here, and I knew a little bit of her story, but not as much as I would come to know. And she thought that was great, and so we met, and we pretty regularly, and she told me the story of her family, and I totally got into her family deep. So basically, Laura's family goes back to probably the pre-Spanish period in California. The San Gabriel area, for those of you that aren't from California or Southern California, the San Gabriel mission was one of the earliest missions settled by the Spanish, and the reason they settled San Gabriel mission, and also the largest native population, was because the river and the rich land. It was way more valuable than most of the other missions were to the Spanish. And so her family comes from there, the native people before then, and her family was probably among the groups of people that were enslaved by the San Gabriel mission. after the mission closed and the Mexican period came and into the 19th century, a lot of the families that came out of that history, which Laura's family did, became scattered around the San Gabriel area, intermarrying with Mexican Californios or Mexican immigrants that started coming in to California. In fact, one piece of information that was really interesting was that the women of the townships that came out of those communities would marry the Mexican immigrant men that came as laborers. And so that's how these communities started. A lot of the Southern California Chicano communities have that history that goes way back. It's interesting, nobody ever talks about it, and not a lot of research is done on that. But anyway, that's Laura's lineage. Her maternal lineage would be Native California. So that's where she comes from. I think is her grandmother's, yeah. I don't want to. Her grandmother, she was very close to her grandmother, who is the woman that was probably, I would say, the most influential in her life. She was an artist. She was also a nature woman. She liked to go hiking. She fished, and she was a big rock collector. And one of the things that in fact, the only thing that I got from Laura as a gift from her will was the rock her grandmother collected, which was a 300-pound rock that a friend of mine actually went, and it's in my front yard, and it looks like a big butt with a crack.
Yeah.
And I saw that at her, and I'm telling the story because this is the point. When I was at Laura's house a lot and saw the rock, I go, oh my God, Laura, like, what's that? And, I hadn't seen it before. She goes, oh, that's my grandma's. And I go, really? And she goes, yeah, she was a rock collector. I go, Laura, do you know this rock looks like all the rocks that you've been photographing, especially in Joshua Tree? And she was, I don't know, she was kind of like, yeah, maybe. Yeah. That was Laura.
Yeah, pretty much.
And it all clicked for me there. And I was in the middle of the research and the writing at that point. And I don't know if any of you have read the essay in the Show and Tell catalog, but where I went with that is that her work is deeply, deeply rooted in her native maternal lineage and a deep, deep connection with the rocks and the San Gabriel River, the Rio Hondo River. And yeah, those people were not only huge, huge ground underneath Laura, and she grew up along the river, played in the river, but those people were around when I was doing this research too. I felt them. We would hike in the river. I just felt that a lot of them are buried at the San Gabriel Mission Cemetery. So that's where this work comes from, in my opinion.
Meanwhile, what was Laura's kind of photographic coming of age like? You've described that she is largely self-taught, and right away her practice is really grounded in portraiture in terms of representing both herself and members of her communities. What was this period of her early career like, and was she supported?
Her brother.
Her early career, her brother self-taught at East LA College for a while. Chris can talk a little bit.
Then she went to PCC, Pasadena City College. Yeah. That's where she got diagnosed.
Yeah, actually, there's a side story when she was in school. Photography.
Yes.
He told her, he goes, never going to amount to a good photographer.
And also
and what's his name? Yeah.
Some of the teachers I had at East LA College as well told her the same thing, and then they taught me. So it's kind of interesting.
So she wasn't nurtured, I think, academically, but then later on, she found her with May.
Yeah, like May Valenzuela was her huge influence at East LA College and some other faculty as well. And through there, she found herself, and May was very, very tough on her about like reprinting, printing, making sure that the concept and the technical were like together. So I think that's where Laura learned a lot of her craft, like doing that. And then she did workshops much later in the late 80s and 90s. She had workshops with Joyce Tennyson. That was a major influence, and I think Judy Dater as well. Mm-hmm. So, and here is some examples of Laura's early portraiture. So there's Gil Cuadros. That's one of Laura's favorite portraits of Gil. And then here's Ricardo and S.B. Valverde, who's at the Center of Creative Photography work. Check it out. It's really good. Yeah, so as far as like, and then her finding her voice, I think she was very shy, and that's why she went to portraiture, because portraiture was a way to kind of talk to people. And then eventually the portraiture from other people became self-portraiture in the late 90s or early.
Yeah, in the 80s, she started meeting a lot of the artists that you see up there. Irene Cervantes and Barbara Carrasco became really good, close friends, and they're very renowned today artists from Chicano artists in Los Angeles. And a lot of other people that I introduced her to some of these people, and then they would introduce her to other people. And I would say by the late 1980s, she started hanging out at Self-Help Graphics, photographing the Day of the Dead events, but by the late 80s, she was really connected to the Chicano arts community. Everybody knew her. She wasn't friendly with everybody. Laura would be kind of shy, and most people would say, what's wrong with her? Doesn't she like me? Because she would not be friendly. And I don't think it was that she didn't like people. I think she was just extremely shy. Had a lot to do, I think, with her childhood, growing up with dyslexia, how she was treated by the teachers in her school. They thought she was mentally challenged. They thought she was a Spanish speaker, but she didn't speak Spanish because she didn't speak English as well. She didn't speak English well because she had auditory dyslexia. So there are a lot of issues as growing up that kept her very quiet and shy, and in a way, not antisocial, because she had a lot of friends, just not very sociable to strange people that she would meet. But she did get very connected with the Chicano community, and I think that's where her photography started to really evolve, and finding her niche and finding her genre. And then she came out in the late 80s and moved on into the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, I mean, clearly that community was so important for her and so close-knit, and I think that kind of gets to a misconception that some people have about Laura, that she was utterly, like, unknown until after her death. Like, she was important in these circles during her life.
Yeah, she was very well known, like, in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and now. But I think when people still find, like, when they find out about her for the first time, they just assume she just did something like recent or something like that, or she discovered a type of photography with the text, for example.
Or she went out in the desert nude and photographed herself.
Yeah,
and she just came out there and did that. But there's this whole backstory.
Yeah, like she was around, like doing stuff before it. That unfortunately, she doesn't get talked about historically, like until more recently. And like she's been written so much in like academic papers and research and dissertations. Like she's there, but of course it's still very hidden, because like, you know, most people only know a certain body of work, not like earlier portraits or like later work too, is like the self-portraits that are just not in the desert, but like just nude portraits as well.
I think where that really came out was with show and tell.
Yeah, show and tell. Really
so show and tell, and I'm not going to get into the whole story, but basically there was another curator of show and tell. Her name was Karen Rapp, and she was the one that came on board with the Chicano Studies Research Center. She did a checklist of Laura's work, but most of it was 90s, mid to 90s, and then the nudes in nature. And so when Karen was no longer the curator and I came on board and looked at the checklist, it's like there's this whole bunch of time and work and I think the basic grounding of Laura as a photographer that wasn't really there. And so we went back to UCLA and where the work was at that time. We'll talk more about UCLA in a minute, and found pieces from back then. And what that did was it gave Laura this huge arc of a photographer's life by the time she had finished with her last series. And the story was much more deeper and more meaningful. So that story did get told in show and tell, but a lot of people didn't see show and tell. A lot of people didn't read the catalog. And so still, the nudes in nature what skyrocketed her into the place she is today.
But if we go to show some other ones, so here's an example of early portraiture from the Day of the Dead series. Interestingly enough, I think she helped build the coffin and she brought the fabric, and then everything else was at the LA Center of Photography, where she took these series. So there's Harry Gamboa and his sister and his son.
Yeah,
famous.
that was the big LA Day of the Dead. After Self-Help, they became another space in LA that hosted Dia de los Muertos events and exhibits. Actually, they had a bigger exhibit than Self-Help.
Yeah.
And Laura was working there, or was very involved with that center, and
Yeah.
did these photographs there.
And here's an example about, so people assume Laura was like not smart enough or she didn't understand the history of photography. Here's a prime example of that. Laura knew the history of photography. She knew her contemporaries. She knew who was working, and not her contemporary, but like other who became before her. Here's an example of how she was inspired for the Latino lesbian series. She actually was from Dwayne Michaels, who was also a queer photographer, and his photo right here with a letter from his father inspired her to do Latino lesbians, because she thought the text, but then in a different context of, having these important women who are actually lesbian and working, and they're not like the lower class. She wanted to show them in a higher sense they're actually doing important things. So that's the inspiration for that. So here's an example, Dwayne Michaels, and this is the famous image she had from that. Here's Carla Barboza, the famous Latina lesbian, and from that series as well.
And the subjects would write on the work, right? So this is the people, the sitters for these portraits. Laura's inviting them to participate in the storytelling. And
so she had all the sitters write their own text. She would photograph the text, then she would send it out to get a negative from that, and then she would take the print in the darkroom, the negative, and then she would put like a contact printing, basically. So yeah, so people, when they ask me, oh, can you reprint these and do it? I go, no, we can't, because it's such a laborious process. You just have to work from the original print that I scanned. So yeah, for the trust, which we'll go into that a little later. But yeah, and here's the image we wanted to mention, that this is the image that broke Laura free, which is Three Eagles Flying.
Right, yeah. Oh, we went there. Yeah, but back up to just with Carla, and the Latina lesbian series was really her first big breakout series. I mean, the Chicano stuff was very cool, and a lot of people knew about it, but it was going to be this series
and
that was going to really kind of move her out into a larger audience. I would consider it her first breakout series, and a lot of the women that she was involved with, like Chris said, were professional, and the text is mainly about how they feel about their sexual identity and pride in that, or coming out, those kinds of stories. So it was very timely. And the Chicana lesbian activism in the late 80s was on in LA. It was big. It was a big movement. So she kind of was at the place at the right time for that conversation.
Yeah, most of the women in the series is from GLUE.
Right.
And Lesbianas Unidas. And there's a PBS documentary about that whole movement and scene. So Laura was a part of that as well, but she's kind of like behind the scenes, taking pictures. So.
And about 4 years later, she'll do The Plush Pony, which was a different series of Chicano lesbian, more working class women she met in a bar, and that was another big breakout series. But I think this one was
this was like the first, like her kind of getting into what we would know of Laura, and then from this series we get into the next image, which is Three Eagles Flying. So.
Yeah, this is a really powerful work. I feel like she's talking about being in between identities, in between cultures. Can you talk a little bit more about what this image means to both of you?
I think for me, I'll tell a little story about it. Laura would come to my house all the time after she was now doing photographs, and I think I saw pretty much every series that she did, where she'd bring to my house. She'd have her contact sheets or little small prints in a box, and she was so shy and so humble. And she'd go, "Oh, I just wanted to show you some new work," just like that. I go, "Okay." So she'd pull it out, and I'd see it. And then one day she came with Three Eagles Flying, and I'll never forget this. She pulls it out and she puts it together, and I can't remember if it was it framed? My daughter's here, and my daughter and my son-in-law were around at that time. It was framed, it was at my house, and we just saw it, and it was just like, oh my God. And my reaction when I told Laura, I go, "This is gonna make you famous." And it did. It took a while. Yeah, and it really wasn't what made her famous. What made her famous was the nudes in nature. But this is the piece that was just the... I did a show in 1990. I curated an exhibit called Image and Identity. I can't remember the title. Image and Identity. It was at the Laban Gallery at Loyola Marymount. And I had 5 artists, 4 were painters, and Laura. And it was in 1990, so this was new. And all the work everybody did was great, but this was the work that everybody came talking about. It was just kind of mind-blowing for the time. Nobody was doing anything like this. And just in terms of female nudes, you know, nobody did this. It was all much more objectified, the female body from a male gaze, whereas this was much more real and a non-sexualized, really, self-depiction of her body.
And so I was just going to get into her reception, actually. You just mentioned you showed this image in an exhibition you curated.
Yes.
And so was that primarily where she was showing at the time, kind of like through the 80s, early 90s? Was it kind of mostly in East LA and venues there?
This was actually West LA. It was a Loyola Marymount University. She was in shows by the 90s. I think the lesbian series got her into other, you know, in Mexico, and in other places.
I think New York as well. Like she was starting to blossom.
Yeah, right. And she had already met Judy Dater and
she met Judy Dater in the late
Joyce
90s,
Jennison.
like early 90s, and then eventually it just started from there. She started showing in different museums and smaller galleries, and yeah, I think that's.
She was known.
What about museums purchasing her work? Were they acquiring from her? It was mostly exhibitions.
No, nobody was really purchasing work. She would give out her work to friends for free. There's a lot of work that I found out through the trust that they're like, oh, I have a Laura Aguilar print, and I go, is it signed? Because that, you know, we want to make sure it was signed. But sometimes she signed her work, and then sometimes she didn't. And later, other times, like she would give it to somebody, and then they would give it to the institution, because that's how that worked. But at the time, it wasn't selling, especially in the 90s. I would say maybe some museums bought work later in the 2000s when she got with her gallerist, Suzanne Millimeter, 2000s. But it was very low. She got shown in Europe for a couple, some shows, but again, nobody was really purchasing.
She was in a lot of shows, a lot of catalogs. Different.
They wanted to show Three Eagles Flying, Latina Lesbians, Plush Pony, and some from the Clothes series, but not, you know, it's always like, for example, some of these. So.
And so now we're in the mid 90s. We're almost to where she starts doing nature self-portrait.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have a couple more images from these earlier series.
Yeah, this is the Clothes series where, if anybody remembers the series of, from what photographer was it who did he was a fashion photographer, and I should know this being a history photography student. Oh my God, what's his name?
The German guy.
Helmut Newton. Yeah, Helmut Newton. She was inspired by that portrait where he took out the models that were clothed and then unclothed. So this kind of inspired her to do that, her series, but then she wanted to photograph her friends and family who were like different races, different backgrounds. So these, like we just saw, are just different examples. And they're such like powerful images of her friends. They're not erotic. They're more like just everyday. They're just being, you know, clothed and unclothed. So.
And it grew out of Three Eagles Flying.
Yeah.
Where she did herself nude. She also did another self-portrait called In Sandy's Room, which was another big breakout piece. They were the first 2 nudes in nature that she did. But she started photographing herself nude. So the first one that we saw was Laura clothed and clothed. Then she moved on to her friends. And it really is I don't know, it showcases a lot of the marginalized community in LA at that time. You know, gay and lesbian couples.
Straight, interracial,
people of color.
And
this is again the prelude to.
Oh, this is a prelude to the nudes.
Yeah.
And here's an example of one person. This is Willie Middlebrook, too, who is very influential in Laura's life. He helped her get a residency at Lightwork, where he did his version of the his 12 Willies that's in, I think it's in LACMA's collection, where it's just self-portraits of Willie. He inspired Laura to do her 12 Lauras. And then he also inspired her to do a lot of self-portraits. So it's kind of like the lineage. And also, if you hear the Bloomberg app, I talk about how Willie was the first person to print the Grounded series. And then I came in later and finished it up because he passed away. And then Laura didn't want nothing to do with that series because it was the connection of Willie. So, yeah, but here's Willie with his kids.
He also helped her out a lot with equipment and with paper,
Yeah.
and chemicals, and because Laura didn't have any money, and he was really, really important to her as a friend and as a fellow artist, and he literally supported her and helped her. I think Three Eagles Flying was going to be smaller.
Yeah, it was going to be
It was
smaller.
gonna be and he goes, "You need to make that big."
Yeah.
So, and he had the paper, and so that was the collaboration there.
Yeah. And here's
Yeah, and so here we get to Nature Self-Portrait, which is the first series that the exhibition here includes. It's her first series where she goes out into the natural world, photographing herself. I feel like it's been so valuable kind of seeing the lead up to this, because you mentioned earlier that she really kind of becomes famous for this work and Grounded, the final Nature series in particular, but there was this whole evolution of her career of photographing herself and others and members of marginalized communities. And this feels like such a departure in so many ways. And I wonder if you can tell us about just where Laura was at in her life that yielded this pivot to the natural world.
I think it was depression. I think we could kind of blanket that, and she's beginning to experience a lot of loss. Her mother died, like I said, in the 80s, but her father was ill, and then Gil will die. Gil passed away of AIDS, I think, in 1996.
Yeah, he died. He died in 1996.
But even before that, she's dealing with depression, and she's suicidal, and is going on and off meds or adjusting meds, trying to find stability. And I think she would be up and down. And I think at one of these points, she met up with a friend and fellow photographer, Delilah Montoya, who was in New Mexico at the time, or she's from New Mexico. I know she's there now, but she was there then.
I think she was.
And they did a road trip, kind of just be with Laura and help her out, and they went traveling around, and that's where the Nature Self series emerged.
Because this one was the Nature Self-Portrait was taken in New Mexico.
And this is Laura's favorite picture of herself, right?
Yes, this is Laura's favorite. I mean, if once you got to know Laura, she'll tell you, she would say, "Oh, I love every image I've ever taken." Like when we were curating the show and tell exhibition, she wanted everything on the wall, but we had to convince her, like, we don't have enough space. So, but for sure, for Nature Self-Portrait, she said this is the one, like if I've ever, for what I'm known for, she loves this one because she's free in the desert and she feels happy and at peace. That's like her main thing
It's her
about
favorite self-portrait.
Yeah.
And it was frontal. too,
It's frontal.
which is a little different than most of the work she did. Desert.
Because most of the images that were collected after were always Laura not facing the camera, her hair's covering it, or we see her back. So yeah, it was like at the time when we were asking curators, why are you picking only these that are not showing? They didn't really have an answer. Then when some other curators said, oh no, we see Laura frontal, it's very powerful. So it's like a mixture of, that's what we were finding out when acquisitions were happening, especially with the nudes. So.
Yeah, I think we have a couple more images here from the series that are on view upstairs.
Yes.
I just think what she's doing is so sophisticated. I mean, there's a performance element to
Yes.
it. That undercurrent, I think, is really compelling. One of the things that people often wonder about is like, what was her process like making these? Like, can you tell us about her kind of process out in the field and just the kind of mechanics of it, going out and making the images?
I think it really was performative, and nature self-portrait was just her self-portraits. But then when she got into motion and stillness, she began to ask other people to participate with her. Different workshops she would do, like in Texas, she was involved with Art Space and the Guadalupe Center, and she would ask some of the women involved. So then they became much more performative with other people in them. And a lot of times the women that would pose with her were often women that were asked to help her too. Yeah. So she didn't just go out into nature by herself, carrying all her stuff. There was always helpers. I helped her in Joshua Tree with the Grounded series, but these series were all done, like started with nature self-portrait. Delilah was there, stillness and motion, and center, there were other women there. And then sometimes she would ask these women to pose for her nude too. And sometimes they did, and sometimes she didn't. One of my greatest regrets, I'll just say it right now, is not posing for Clothed Unclothed. She asked me probably 20 times to do it, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And sorry.
I mean, I would add to, like, when knowing Laura and talking with her and getting to know her, learning about her process, was she was also a great master photographer. She was very technical. She was always like wanting everybody to know her as a photographer first, then an artist, because she wanted to make sure her prints were done well. She would always like slave over a print and go back in the darkroom. She'd be like, is it too dark, too light? That stuff. And she would show me all her test prints, and I could see the variations. They're very subtle. And working with her too, because when I got to print Grounded, I learned so much about printing with Laura, and I understood why she would spend hours in the darkroom. And then I realized, because she had the same mentor as mine, and she did the same thing to me. I would go back in the darkroom. Like after I finished everything, I'd go turn in my equipment, and then my professor, Mavance, I was like, oh, look, I finished that print. And she'll be like, yeah, it looks okay, but it could be better. And I was like, oh my God. And then I just finished like an hour or two just finishing this print. And it's funny, now I instill that with my students. And I'm like, when they show me something, I'm like, it could be better. Just because I think it's something, because like you never want to strive for like to think that's perfect, like you always could be better. And Laura was like that till the end. She'll look at her work, she's like, oh, if I only had a chance to like reprint that, to redo it. So yeah, learning about that, and then just looking at her negatives, you could see like how particular, like changing of an f-stop or a shutter speed or changing of a lens could just mean so much. So I think that's something too that people often forget. They look at the subject matter and they think it's beautiful, but then there's so much technical that goes into her negatives and her prints. So. Yeah.
And there's really valuable footage of her at work in the documentary with the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center. I'm blanking on the name of it.
Oh, Untouched Landscape.
Yes, Untouched Landscape. And you see her working with an assistant and kind of going back and forth from the camera and bracketing exposures, like you're mentioning. And
huge. She loved bracketing, and I think it's important to. Students don't really teach us much about bracketing anymore, but it's important because just a slight difference in like under and over exposure can really help like your image, and especially in digital. When she was shooting Grounded, it was all digital. Film, you can get away with more latitude, especially with certain older film. New contemporary films, there's not as much different, and then chemistry as well. She would like mix her own chemistry. So I think she used a lot of Kodak Dectal for the photo nerds out there. It's like photo Dectal. I think they still make it, but it's still different. And then paper is not the same because there's so much different silver-based prints out there that are not the same compared to what she was making. She was using AGFA paper. So. Then when I did the prints for the show and tell, when I actually did darkroom prints, I used Ilford. And I was trying to match the prints, and it was such a hassle because it's just going to look different. So,
yeah. I mean, the rigor of her process and her deep commitment to print craft is something that I think is really important to understand about her. And that really comes across in the footage of her in the documentary. Like, she's really focused. She's ultra focused and just so thoughtful about each composition. She would wear kind of loose-fitting clothing so that she could, clothe and unclothe herself quickly and get into the pose. And you've also shared that she used props to kind of soften, the rocks for her skin, because it's rough, posing out there in the landscape. And she had a flip-flop, right?
Flip-flop or a towel or something that she could hide underneath. Because the rocks in Joshua Tree, they have little pointy like glass. It's like pointed glass. So to sit on it without clothing, even your hand or anything, pretty painful. So she did, and she had to adjust. It took a while for her to find a comfortable, the pose she wanted, plus being able to hold it.
So Nudes in Nature was not the focus of Show and Tell in 2017. That was, a major retrospective, her first big retrospective. And I'd love to hear you talk about, why you conceived the idea for the show here being the focus on Nudes in Nature in relation to Show and Tell, and kind of what these exhibitions are doing for her legacy.
I think we didn't want to be redundant, for one thing, but also the power of all these series together for the first time ever in a significant number in each series was just something. When Becky proposed the idea to us, it just was, oh yeah, we'll do her Nudes in Nature every series. And I think each series has 10, 12 more or less pieces. So this has never happened before. She's done big shows with, let's say, stillness and motion.
Or nature self-portrait.
Yeah, or nature self-portrait, but never anything like we're seeing here in Phoenix. So it's pretty good opportunity to see the entire body of work. Almost everything is in the show.
Yeah, it's just like Center, for example, has like a lot of images that, because we had to edit down, right. And then some of them, because like there's no prints. They were printed, but then or they were lost or stolen or whatever. But like trying to match the prints of that was fun printing, because I was like, okay, I don't know what it looks like, so I have to go off another print. Motion and stillness have a pretty good significance. There are more than 16 images in the series. Grounded has 16. Nature Self-Portrait has 16, and I think that's it. Because every series she had like a certain amount. She shot so much, and then she would pick particularly what image, but then she would shoot more, and then she would like. And it's funny because some images there's like duplicates of the same image, but just slight difference of composition. Yeah. And then she couldn't decide, so she just put them both in the series. So, yeah, she was very particular about like that too.
Yeah, and it's great how with Show and Tell, that really kind of catapulted her in the art world to more recognition, and was this incredible retrospective. And now that you've had this, big arc kind of treatment of her show, I feel like it empowers you to do these more focused projects about particular bodies of work.
I mean, before, the museum wouldn't even talk to you. I mean, they would, but they wouldn't. And after Show and Tell was great because we connected up to a major festival in Los Angeles, the LA Latino Festival, an initiative from the Getty. And so we also had funds to do a major catalog. But the other, I guess it was this wonderful, empowering, and everybody from all over the world basically came to LA Latino. But the underside of that was that Laura was sick, and she had been sick for a long time, but was getting sicker. And by the time, I really do think Laura willed herself to be alive for the opening reception, because this had been such a goal and desire of hers. And so when the recognition started clicking with Show and Tell, and people are coming to buy work, it just was this very fast thing. Laura was declining rapidly, so it was kind of like this at the same time, and then she passed 3 months after Show and Tell closed, and I think because it closed in February. She died in April.
Yeah.
3 months. And then the whole thing just blew up. And a year later, it was just crazy with so much interest and fielding everything we had to field as trustees, and we'd never done it before, you know.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you speak more about just the work of being co-trustees for her estate and what your work entails, and kind of share with everyone, like, what does that look like day to day, and how does it relate to the broader notion of Laura's legacy?
I think, did we show the slides or did we talk about Yolanda Redder?
No, if you go, that one right here.
Yeah, so when Laura was alive, she had archived her work at UCLA. And contrary to a lot of ideas that have been floating around, the person that got her work to UCLA was Yolanda Redder. And Yolanda was a very active political activist in Latino lesbian community. Yeah. She was in a lot of organizations. She also had become the archivist and the librarian for the Chicano Studies Research Center. So Yolanda wanted Laura's work to be protected, and this is going back to 2007, right? Or no, before, no,
2004.
Yeah, and so she got together with a lawyer friend who did the trust with Laura, and she was the first trustee. Yeah. Yolanda was the first trustee. Yolanda's the one that got Laura's work to UCLA, not anybody else that has been said to have done that. And Yolanda was going to take care of it, but then Yolanda died in 2007. She died much, I guess, unexpectedly, much sooner than Laura thought. And then Laura's work was housed at UCLA with no trustee. And that's when a number of years go by, and we're already doing show and tell, when she asked Chris and I to be her trustees after, 6 or 7 years, no, 8 or 9 years. Something. Of just sitting at UCLA with nobody taking care of anything. And nothing's going anywhere because nobody's buying anything, and Laura didn't sell her work, and show and tell was just beginning to be pulled together. So that's where it started when she asked us in 2016 to be the trustees of her estate, which to me at the time thought helping her die. Yeah. And maybe doing something with UCLA's collection. That's where we were at with this.
Yeah, because because I think she had the foresight of seeing, like, she knew that when she goes, something was going to happen, or her work was going to, like, get sold or not, or she wanted us to get her work into collections. That was the main goal of the trust. However, at the same time, when Laura was kind of in and out of the hospital, she kind of always mentioned, like, oh, people are going to remember me. That was her big thing. If people are going to know me, are they going to remember me? And she wanted to make sure her work got out there. But I mean, I could also say this, because I worked at the Chicano Studies Center at the same time when the archives were there, and the archives weren't really taken care of. They were just in different rooms. They were not there. So I was trying to work on it while doing the show and helping you and others with the catalog and whatnot. And Laura would also sometimes, like, this is an image from 2014, she would go to the archives, sit down with her own boxes, and just start labeling stuff. Because she said, for me, like, when everybody goes through my archive, I want them to know what I picked. And so she was very adamant about her archives and how they looked and what they in those boxes as well. But unfortunately, during the time of the UCLA, like, people would try to get boxes, go through stuff. So things got disorganized a lot. So I was trying to get them to not have anybody go through them or have private access, because people were just taking stuff. This is before I started working there, and then I found out later. So when I left the center, I became Laura's studio manager and, like, was just trying to help her with stuff, because people were trying to take advantage of her at the time. They would ask for, hey, we want these images. They wanted images for catalogs and everything, but they never wanted to pay her. They never wanted to pay for framing work or anything like that, but then they would just keep the work. So I found this out through a lot of investigation. So I told the center after I left, I said, you have no like legal right to do anything. They had people signing on behalf of Laura as, like, a power attorney. And I found this out, so that's why doing this before the trustee stuff, I was just trying to protect her and then sign agreements for her, just read over stuff because they were just, in the fine print, they would, oh, if we're going to show your work, we're going to do this and we're going to keep the print. That's how some institutions got her work at this time. So yeah, so just protecting her in that sense. And then when she just asked us like straight out, it's like, hey, I made the choice of putting you guys as my trustees. And I was like, what? I didn't know what that meant. But then now later on, I figured out why she did, because I was protective of her. And it's okay if I cuss, right? Because I'm speaking as Laura because she's told me this, but she's like, I'm putting you as my trustee because I know you're a bitch. She said that straight out. I'm not lying, of course. They could edit it for YouTube. But she said that, and I take that very like to my heart because that's what she said. So, I mean, it's true because I was very protective of her, and I noticed how people were taking advantage of her. So I wanted to make sure that doing that as a trustee was like, okay, when people ask for stuff, I'm like, no. Or are you going to pay? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do that? So, and as far as like what we do as trustees, it's mostly we get emails. Sometimes we get phone calls. And then we just call each other, or we sit down and say, hey, did you see the email? Let's go over it. Let's talk it over. What do you think? Or does this sound great? Does this not? Or is it even plausible to do? So that's a lot of what we do. We go back and forth. We'll check emails. We send emails back. Yeah, so that's pretty much what we do as far as the trustee stuff. But
I think to back up a little bit, when Laura asked us to be the trustees, again, we weren't really sure what that was going to mean. And then when she passed, everybody wanted to buy her work. And so we had to figure stuff out, and we didn't know. And so the first thing we did was we hired an advisor. And we hired an art advisor who was actually very helpful in helping us do to do the archive and to create our listings of her work, and to also price for us. So we were like really in unknown territory, and she was helpful. And then and UCLA was helpful, the archivist there. Javiera was helpful. We had staff coming in to help us. I mean, it took us a year to archive her work, driving out to UCLA. I mean, doing that. And then what happened is we were getting ready, and at this time Laura she was still alive.
she was in hospice.
It's a very looking back for me, because basically I was the one that was helping her die, and it was a very, very difficult time, because we're trying to do this, and then I would come back and see her in the hospital and be dealing with hospital staff or nursing home staff, and Laura was not a good patient. She was rebellious, but that was so true to her nature. I mean, maybe I would do that too, I don't know. I mean, she was just resistant, and she was also losing her mind a little bit, and she wouldn't take her meds, and then she'd take her meds, and then she'd throw things, and she'd be angry. And some of the nursing homes she was in were very unpleasant. And it was just, so that's going on, and I'm doing that. And then we're like trying to archive her work, going out to UCLA, driving home from UCLA at like 6 o'clock at night on a weeknight, which is insane if you're not from LA.
I would say Sybil was doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the beginning of the trust and stuff, because I was in grad school.
Yeah, Chris was out of town. And then when we finally were starting to pull it together, and we had worked with the advisor, and I'm talking to Laura. I'd go see her in the hospital. I'll never forget going to Alhambra Hospital.
Oh, that was the worst.
Yeah, and actually that hospital wasn't that. It was hospitals are good compared to nursing homes. And I went to tell her, because we were talking to the Getty at that time, and maybe having some possibility of archiving her work with the Getty. And I went to tell her, and by that time she was really in and out of awareness, and she'd say, "Oh, that's nice." And that was like so heartbreaking, because her career is just like soaring, and she was dying. But I think to push ahead to what happened, so the work is at UCLA, we had it organized, and then 2020, and then the pandemic, and everything comes to like a screeching halt. And the woman we were working with, our advisor, started saying, oh, well, you just got to sell to private collectors because museums aren't going to buy, which was completely not true.
Nope.
And so we start selling to private collectors, which is not really what we wanted to do, because for us it was all about Laura's legacy, and the legacy is in the museum, in the public collections, and so we had to work through that. And meanwhile, people are calling us and telling us all kinds of. One guy, remember that one guy? He says, I need to take over the trust because blah blah blah.
Yeah, he was in New York.
Who are you? Stuff like that happened for about a year. And as all this was happening, Chris and I were gaining ground on ourselves. Like, oh, we can do this. We don't need to hire someone. We know what we can do. And we had, I think Chris and I, to say this, is that we both have very different skills. I'm not a photographer. I don't know that much about process. But Chris is amazing. And I'm a writer, and I'm a curator, and I do other stuff. So we've been a very good team. And between the two of us, we've been able to manage this thing and take it to some very different place than it would have been if we worked with the advisor, who would have sold to all her friends and private collectors, and it would have been a very different situation. But she was very helpful in the beginning.
Yeah, we learned a lot from her.
We learned a lot from her.
But then after a while, I think we just started picking up and getting ground.
Yeah, we learned how to navigate ourselves, and that's how we went from show and tell to archiving, to creating this collection, to being a trust that really is actively involved with selling and placing her work with museums.
Because if you go to not the next site, but the one after, not this one, the next one, this is the archive. Well, most of it, because in 2020, so the pandemic happened. So with working with UCLA, it was very limited of when we can go and get boxes. We couldn't get in. So eventually they let us go in. So we went in and we're like, okay, let's do one series at a time because nothing else was happening. So we would go in and just get a series. So here's an example of I went in and we got Clothes on Clothes. So we got all the boxes, and because we were at home all day during the pandemic.
And we really need to give credit to Javiera Flores, who was the archivist at UCLA. She would go to UCLA because you couldn't get in, and she would actually meet us. And
she would go outside,
wheel the stuff outside. So she was very, very helpful in getting the stuff out, because if it hadn't been for her, we wouldn't have been able to get in, and probably we wouldn't have been able to do sales for about a year.
Yeah,
and a lot of really important sales happened in that year.
Yeah, 2020. I think 2021 and 22 were the biggest sales we went through. But then eventually we got to go to, once it started easing up, we got to go in. And one day we just went with my dad's pickup truck truck, Ford Explorer 2003. And we just went in and we just got everything out in one. We got all the rest of the work, as you could see in the other image. And most of the things were archived pretty okay, but once it came back to us, we really had to go back in and really search for what's thing, because some prints were in other boxes, and then that's how we did sales, where we found that we're hey, we actually have an extra copy of this image or nature self-portrait. So it was a lot of going back and forth, and
then we had to deal with lawyers. We had Laura's lawyer, who did the original trust, was our first lawyer, and then she retired. And she was actually Laura's friend. Yeah. And she was very, very chill and very sweet to work with, and she was always available. Then she sold her business to a pretty high speed trust attorney in Pasadena, who was very hard to get a hold of. So we had to navigate that. We also have an heir to the trust, which is Laura's nephew, and he is basically the owner of the work. But he's been very good about what we're doing, so he's been supportive. And then we've had to hire an art lawyer, because in doing a lot of the work with the trust, we've had, that it gets way more than stuff we can do. So it needs to be. So now we're dealing with lawyers, and they take forever. You try.
Except for art lawyer Megan. Her name is Megan.
She's cool. Yeah.
She's very helpful as far as helping us.
She's more available.
She's more available, and she helps us with a lot of copyright, which is very important, and especially as an artist or any artist, especially those who are listening to this later on, they're going to listen to this, like, get yourself to learn about copyright and like your image rights, because that's very important. So yeah, that's what we've been working with. And it's been helpful too, especially working with the art lawyer, because she's telling us, well, okay, like this is what you could do, can't do, don't do this, don't do that. So, and you know, especially like in promotion on like social media, stuff like that too, is also another thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, because like when we did the trust, also we decided to use some of that the funds that we got from the like a lot of acquisitions to like fund a Chicana lesbian to actually do the website for us. And then we actually like I run most of all the social media too, which is another big thing too, because that's where I get a lot of deals came from Instagram, from museums. Like I would go and start following all the institutions. Then I was like cold emailing them on social media, which is don't do, but it worked. Like some institutions message us through there. Other times we just do cold emails when we started messaging institutions. And I do it through Laura's email, and like within a couple days or a couple hours, we got like messages back. So it's been an interesting journey, because I think in the beginning we wouldn't have done that because we didn't know. But then as we got more confident in what we're doing, we were like, okay, let's try it. Let's see what happens. And sometimes some institutions took about a couple of years to get back, but then now it's like, you know, it's happening. So
yeah, the momentum is incredible. I mean, it's really palpable. Like,
yeah.
You know, anyone kind of paying attention to the art world and photo world, you see her everywhere.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. My alarm that I set for myself went off a couple minutes ago, and so I want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So maybe as the audience is thinking about questions that you'd like to ask Chris and Sybil, I'll ask you like one or two more. Yeah, and we have a couple more images, so maybe you can share about these too.
Oh yeah, after Laura passed, we did a couple of memorials for her for Day of the Dead. We did the one on the left was one of the galleries, or one of the museums that Show and Tell traveled to was the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago. And so she had her show there in 2018.
And it's kind of right after Laura passed away.
Yeah, then they invited us to do their Day of the Dead show, and we did an altar for her. And that was really special. And sweet. And then I think we also did one, I guess later that year, at the Avenue 50 Studio, which is a local Northeast LA gallery, and that's the one on the right. Yeah.
Yeah, and this one's interesting. Well, both are very important because both have objects from Laura's house or little trinkets. Like in this one example, we got the door and the window from the house that Laura stayed in, and then all her plants and chair and little things that there. So we tried to make it more real and like dedicated to her. Same thing with the
it's like
image
a recreation of her porch,
which
was a very iconic place. I think we have a photograph of her house coming up too.
Well, and speaking of the plants, this actually ended up inspiring the design of the show. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, Laura was a great gardener, and she always liked to go to nurseries and buy plants, and she had a lot of plants. So when we were looking at the colors for this exhibit, we decided to look at a palette of I think that pot is actually I took a lot of her plants to my house because they would have just died if I would have left them. So I took a lot of pots and a lot of succulents, and this was kind of a combination of the color, the terracotta of the pot and the sage green of the succulents, and we used that, if you've seen the show, as the color palette for the walls.
Yeah, because that's like inspired by the image on the left. Yeah, left. So that's Laura in her front garden with all her plants and the self-portrait. I think you could see the kind of photo cable release in that image as well, somewhere in there. That's how she did it. And then I think on the last, you can see Laura. That's Laura's house in 2017. So you can see like the plants, her garden. There's Laura right there. Isn't this when you picked up Laura for the show? When we did the wreath of...
No, I don't know.
I think, yeah, because she's wearing the same outfit when
Maybe.
you took. No, because you took her to see the show, the walkthrough for Show and Tell.
Yeah.
So.
At the end, it was really hard for her to drive. But one thing I can say about Laura in terms of her personal strength, she drove. By the way, she suffered from diabetes, and she died of renal failure, but had diabetes for a number of years, and she was on dialysis for 8 years, which is kind of a long time to do dialysis, and she drove herself. I didn't even know that. I thought people were picking her up. So she was strong. She was a strong woman. But at the end, when we were doing show and tell, it was really hard for her to drive anymore. Yeah. So she was rapidly declining at the end. You're right. I probably did pick her up for the show that day. Yeah. And the house, which is, you can't probably really see it too well, but that house was built by her grandfather, who was, no, her great-grandfather, who was one of the Mexican immigrant laborers that came from Mexico to work in Southern California and married someone in Laura's maternal lineage. And then he built this house, I think in 1920, something like that. And this was the house that she lived in at the end of her life, but it belonged to her great-grandfather and then her, all the way down to her Aunt Bee, who she lived with. We saw her and Aunt Bee in an earlier photo that she lived with at the end. Then Aunt Bee died, and then she was in the house. Yeah, so the house had a huge history.
Amazing. I think we might have one more image, right? Yeah, here's the final slide. Yeah.
Yeah, this image here is when Laura took us to Joshua Tree to show us where she wanted her ashes to be spread. So this is our last time with Laura out in the desert, and she just liked to be in this area. So that we wanted to end with that, just kind of show Laura in the desert and what she liked. And she liked the cactus, but then she would always say that it was just, she didn't like to be there too long because she just in case if she fell, she would fall into the cactus. So she was very wary of that. So. Yeah, so she was always kind of joking. Even though she was sick and in pain, she would always make jokes and kind of be very dry. She was like, oh yeah, okay. And she was like that, so.
I feel like we've gotten such a wonderful sense of her personality from the stories that you've shared with us today.
Yeah, just think she's very sarcastic and very dry.
Really funny too.
Oh, really funny,
and
very...
also really perceptive. She knew a lot about my life and all my personal drama and problems, and she would just say, well, blah blah blah, and she was totally right. And so she had a deep perception about others. She had her issues and her problems, but she was a really great friend. She was fun to hang out with, and I miss her. She would be the kind of friend that would call you up and say, hey, you want to go Joshua Tree tomorrow? It's like, okay. If I had time, I would go. And we didn't always go to take photographs, but we would go hang out, we'd walk around. This is when she was a little more healthier. Go eat. She liked to eat cheeseburgers and
steak and potatoes.
Sizzler's Steakhouse on Highway 29 and 29.
Oh, yeah, it's still
Palms.
there. It's still there.
It is? I thought.
Yeah, and then Palms.
Yeah, that was her place. Yeah, and I do miss her. I miss her a lot. But she was great. She was a great person.
Yeah, I would go out with Laura to the movies. We'd go see Marvel movies on Tuesdays because it was like $5 at the theater. And then we would go to thrift stores. We would always look for toys. She was a big toy collector. I am too. And yeah, and then I would drive her to UCLA a lot to go to see the archive. And then she would tell me stories about a lot of things. Some stuff I can't say, but yeah, she was always, and then she was just talking about stuff. And then she's like, oh, this reminds me of this. And then at the same time, even though she was sick, she would always I have ideas for new projects. She was always thinking about that. One thing I would say, last thing, is that she was considering doing a last body of work would have been prints of Joshua Tree she did in 20 something, I forgot what year, and they were going to be in black and white. And her idea was wanting to call it The Return, but then she got sick and she couldn't really do it. So technically, Grounded is what people know as her last series, but the toy series is actually. And there's these, she photographed all of her toys, mostly women and robots and stuff like that. And that was her last series. They were kind of portraits.
They were fun portraits. big blow-ups of
Yeah.
toy.
You can see those in the show and tell catalog
Yeah.
from the Vincent Price Art Museum show, which is an amazing resource. It has this incredible range of interdisciplinary essays and lots of pictures. So that's a really excellent resource about her work. I want to make sure that we give you all time to ask questions.
Yes, ask questions.
I'm not
Don't be
sure
shy.
if we have a mic to pass around, but please, if you have questions, yeah, definitely ask.
Or can
ask
we go up and
Sybil.
sit with the person and talk to them like face to face?
Oh, yes, John.
I think, yeah, Laura had met Emilia, and it's the photograph of Emilia and a whole bunch of women. Yes. Yeah, that was, actually, I went to that event. I think I went with Laura to that event. And it was at UC Santa Barbara, and it was some big conference of Chicana artists. So that photograph in that year, it was probably the 80s, was the who's who of Chicana artists that were in, not just in California, but all over. I mean, everybody was there. Diane Gamboa, Irina Cervantes, Esther Hernandez, Barbara, Judy Baca. Judy Baca is good friends with Emilia. Yeah, they were all there, and Laura was there. And I would say that in that photograph, Laura was the youngest woman there. And Emilia and Judy were probably the elder women, but they were all there. And that's an amazing, we had that photograph in Show and Tell. It's a great photo, yeah. And that was a great event, too.
Sorry, I have the mic. I'm curious if you knew if what her parents' perspective and opinions were on her work. I know they died kind of at the start of her photography journey. Did she have the support of her parents, or do you know?
No. Laura's mother died before Laura. Laura was a high school photographer and doing some photography work, but was nothing anywhere near this. And her father, so her mother, I don't know if her mother had stayed, if had not passed away when she did, how that would have been, because she did have a difficult relationship with her mother. And I think the relationship was in competition with the grandmother, who was very close to Laura. And her grandmother, by the way, was also a painter. So, and she painted a lot of the Rio Hondo Valley. It was pretty cool stuff. And her father, I think her father wished Laura had been a different kind of girl. But he was supportive of her, but not of her art. I don't think anybody in her family was supportive of what she did. And then especially once she came out and she was doing some of the series like Clothes on Clothes and some of the, the communities, they weren't interested. And also as Mexican Americans, they were very not Chicano identified, meaning they were not really politically supportive, or they weren't, I guess, how can I say that? That Chicano had much more political progressive meaning and they were much more conservative.
Yes, we have a couple questions here.
Her with the glasses, yeah.
I have them. They're in the archive, but I have them at my house. And sometimes what I do is I hang them on the wall, and then sometimes I put them in the box. No, but they're in the archive. Probably every major museum in the
I would
United
say if you
States.
want to answer that, I would say we have the list on Laura's website. There's the full list. I haven't updated because there's a few new ones, but it's pretty like significant.
It's extensive, and it's every major collection in the United States: East Coast, Midwest, West Coast,
And Canada.
and Europe.
And yeah, and
Yes, in her prints, did she just do one of each, or did she do the same print series of, say, 3 or 4?
so she did an edition printing. So for the nature work, she did mostly an edition of 10 prints. And then she had her artist proofs. And then she had her work prints or test prints. So there's a large amount of like different prints, different sizes. But for example, like the nature self-portrait, there's about addition of 10 like actual prints that are signed and dated and numbered.
Any other questions?
Don't be shy.
There's one in the back.
What has surprised you most about Laura's work or her process?
Okay. Like what surprised us about Laura's work and process? Yeah. Any surprises?
It's all been a surprise. I mean, this working with this story that we've been involved in has just, for me, has just been one surprise after another. If you're talking about process or the process of the estate, or I'm not sure I understand.
Artistic process.
Yeah. It's like her, I guess, the concepts and technical stuff. Well, I could say for myself, working as the trustee and like, because like I worked with Laura in the dark room, and that was surprising. But then I didn't realize how almost militant she was in her process, because she exactly knew what she wanted. She pre-visualized what she wanted on the print and how it's supposed to look, and going back and forth, especially doing the darkroom prints for the show and tell exhibition was intense. But like doing the digital printing, that was much easier because she trusted me to do those work, because she couldn't really tell, and she was colorblind. So I didn't know this until, that was one surprise, was finding out she was colorblind. But I did find out from other friends that she was close with, because she didn't keep us all together. They told us, oh, we knew since like for a long time. And I go, I wish she told me that, because it would have, but then it wouldn't change anything. So that was surprising to me.
Her eyesight was really declining at the end too. So
yeah,
that was part of why she couldn't.
Yeah, so she couldn't really like see. But when I was doing grounded for her, I would say, hey, Laura, would this work? And she's like, oh, I don't know. Yeah, it looks fine. That's how she said it. And I go, well, you can't tell if it's too yellow, whatnot. So, but then when we went to Joshua Tree, I finally got to see how the colors looked. So that would help me print the grounded series to kind of match what grounded should look like. Because again, when I mentioned in the Bloomberg app that Willie was printing the work for her, but he was doing a lot of test printing, different papers, trying to figure out, and that was 2006? So digital printing was way different than it is now. So colors and inks, and they look different. So when I printed back in 2017, 2018, I was trying to imagine what grounded looked like with what technology was at the time too. So that was like a whole process in itself for myself as a photographer. So, but working with Laura helped me really get to that point too, because she was really, very, very particular. So, yeah. Did that answer your question? Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we have to wrap up. So Thank you everyone so much for coming today. This has just been so great.
No, thank you. And thank Phoenix Art Museum and the CCP.
Yeah, thank you to the Phoenix Museum for hosting this.
And the show is up until January 5th, 2025. So we have almost a whole year to see it left. And so please, come see the show and revisit the show and spend time with the work. Thank you.
Thank you.